There was once a name that stretched across nearly half the known world. It appeared in atlases, journals, and explorers' accounts. It covered the northern reaches of Asia like a shadow too large to ignore, too vague to define. That name was Tartaria. For several centuries, the word appeared on almost every European map. To the cartographers of the 16th and 17th centuries, it represented an immense and distant land, a place both known and unknown. Then within less than a century, it vanished. No official decree announced its removal, no recorded war destroyed it, and no historian marked its end. The name simply faded from maps, leaving behind a gap that still unsettles those who look closely enough to notice. The story of Tartaria begins not with certainty but with confusion. In the medieval imagination, geography and myth were inseparable. What lay beyond the frontiers of knowledge was often filled with speculation lands of marvels, monsters, or unseen empires. The term Tartar first appeared in Western texts around the 13th century, used to describe the nomadic armies that swept across Europe under the banner of the Mongols. Chroniclers, hearing the word Tatar, added an extra R, linking it to Tartarus, the Greek underworld. The association of terror and distance became embedded in the name itself. By the Renaissance, the label had expanded far beyond its origins. Mapmakers, relying on limited reports from traders and missionaries, used Tartaria to describe everything east of the Ural Mountains and north of China and Persia. In these maps, the region was divided into zones: Great Tartary, Little Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. The boundaries were imprecise, but the confidence was absolute. For 3 centuries, the word persisted. Even as explorers filled in coastlines and measured latitudes, Tartaria remained as a constant, an empire of assumption. Its disappearance was as quiet as its creation was loud. By the middle of the 19th century, the name no longer appeared on new maps. In its place came the territories of Russia, Siberia, Mongolia, and Central Asia. Scholars today generally interpret this shift as a matter of precision. As imperial cartography expanded and surveying techniques improved, vague regions were divided into administratively defined ones. Yet the speed and completeness of this change continue to raise questions. If Tartaria had never been real, why did its absence feel like the loss of something familiar? Perhaps the answer lies not in what Tartaria was, but in what it represented. For early modern Europe, it was a symbol of the world beyond control, a space of ambiguity that could be drawn but not governed. Maps at the time were not only records of geography, they were instruments of authority. To name a land was to claim knowledge of it, and knowledge implied ownership. The disappearance of Tartaria coincided with the moment when empires demanded exactness. The undefined became inconvenient. The 19th century was an age of standardization. Clocks, borders, and languages were aligned under the logic of empire. The world was to be measured, classified, and divided. In this new order, there was little room for the undefined territories of earlier maps. A name like Tartaria, sprawling, imprecise, and unclaimed, did not fit the emerging system. As the Russian Empire expanded across Siberia and Central Asia, the term became obsolete. What had once been an imagined whole was absorbed into measurable parts. But in that absorption, something else happened. The cultural memory of the name, its presence across centuries of writing and cartography, was quietly erased. Few asked where it had gone. Fewer still questioned why it had ever been there. The world simply accepted a new version of itself. Some historians see this as progress, the natural refinement of knowledge. Others note that the boundary between correction and replacement can be thin. When one worldview replaces another, the transition often requires forgetting. The disappearance of Tartaria, seen in this light, was not just a cartographic adjustment, but a shift in consciousness. A word that had once symbolized vastness was replaced by lines of precision. Mystery gave way to measurement. Old maps now rest in archives, their pages yellowed and brittle, their names frozen in an older vocabulary. Across them, the word Tartaria still stretches in bold letters, crossing mountains, rivers, and deserts that no single empire ever ruled. To modern eyes, these maps may look naive, but they reveal something about the human need to fill the unknown with form. Naming is a kind of creation, and unnaming a kind of destruction. The silence that followed the disappearance of Tartaria is striking. One might expect debate, or at least acknowledgement. Instead, it was as if the world had collectively agreed to turn the page. In university lectures, the term survived only as a linguistic curiosity, an obsolete name for Northern Asia. In public imagination, it disappeared entirely. The transition reflects a deeper truth about how history functions. It does not simply record what happened, it continually edits itself to reflect what a civilization needs to believe. The disappearance of a name is never just linguistic, it is psychological. Each erased word marks a choice about what deserves to be remembered. Even now, the remnants of Tartaria linger quietly in the background of history. In architecture and folklore and fragments of text, the echoes persist. They invite questions rather than answers. Was Tartaria merely a misunderstanding of geography, a catch-all for lands beyond comprehension? Or could it have represented a real, though unrecorded, cultural network across Eurasia? The evidence is fragmentary, open to interpretation, and perhaps that is its enduring power. In studying how the name faded, we confront the limits of certainty itself. History is not a stable landscape, but a moving map. Each generation redraws its contours, emphasizing what fits and discarding what does not. Tartaria is one of those discarded contours. Its vanishing reminds us that knowledge is not only discovered, but also managed. What remains today are the traces, the ink on old paper, the recurring curiosity of those who notice its absence, and the quiet discomfort that follows any realization that history might have blind spots. Whether Tartaria was fact or fiction may matter less than what its erasure reveals the fragility of memory when confronted with authority. Every civilization inherits both knowledge and ignorance. The line between them is thin and often invisible. Sometimes, to make sense of the world, humanity must forget parts of it. Tartaria may have been one of those parts, a name too large, too ambiguous, too resistant to definition. And so, like the lands it once described, it disappeared into abstraction. Yet names once spoken for centuries rarely die completely. They leave residues in language and curiosity in the margins of maps. And perhaps that is where Tartaria survives today, not as an empire or a mystery, but as a question. What else have we forgotten so completely that we no longer know we ever knew it? The journey to answer that begins not with rediscovery, but with awareness. The world we inhabit is built upon layers of understanding and omission, and sometimes the omissions are the most revealing. Long before Tartaria vanished from modern atlases, its shape was already forming in the imagination of those who tried to measure the Earth. The map at its core is never neutral. Every line on it represents a decision: what to include, what to omit, and what to invent when knowledge runs out. Between the 12th and 18th centuries, the world's cartographers faced a paradox. They were mapping lands that no one they trusted had ever seen. In that void, a name appeared. The earliest hints of what would become Tartaria can be traced to sources far older than European printing. In ancient Chinese chronicles, the lands north of the Great Wall were described as vast, cold, and rich in resources. They were home to horsemen who moved with the seasons and traded furs and metals across enormous distances. The chroniclers of the Tang and Song dynasties called these peoples by many names: Shui, Khitan, Xiongnu, labels that changed with the centuries but carried the same connotation: a world beyond the empire's control, neither barbarian nor civilized, but essential to both. Farther west, Islamic geographers added new layers to the image. Al-Idrisi, mapping the known world for a Norman king in the 12th century, wrote of northern nations who lived among rivers of ice and grasslands without end. Later scholars such as Rashid al-Din and al-Juwayni described the rise of the Mongols, their disciplined armies, and their web of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the Pacific. These were not fantasies. They were early attempts to describe a system of movement and exchange that spanned continents. But when these accounts reached Europe, translation altered them. Words blurred across languages. Tribes became nations. Regions became empires. Medieval Europe, looking eastward, found itself staring into a void. To fill it, it borrowed. The term Tartar, a fusion of Tatar and Tartarus, entered Latin texts during the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. To terrified chroniclers, the conquerors from the steppes seemed less like men than forces of nature. Their speed, their silence, their unknown origin all fit easily into the framework of apocalypse. For the next 100 years, the Tartars became both a people and a warning. But as fear gave way to curiosity, the name detached from its context. The Mongol Empire fragmented, yet Tartaria remained a label without a ruler, an empire without a capital. The name persisted because it was useful. To Europeans who were expanding their maps faster than their knowledge, Tartaria became shorthand for everything beyond. It covered northern Asia, Central Asia, and sometimes even parts of Siberia and Manchuria. Its borders shifted with every edition, but its presence on paper was constant. The puzzle for modern historians is how this imagined geography became so stable. Early map-making was a collective act of repetition. One chart borrowed from another. One author copied the assumptions of his predecessors. Each repetition gave the illusion of evidence. The more a name appeared, the more real it became. Consider the Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the masterpieces of medieval cartography. Across its parchment, Tartaria Magna stretches across the north of Asia, decorated with cities, rivers, and notes in Catalan script. Some details came from genuine travel accounts. Marco Polo's Il Milione had reached Europe by then, but many were extrapolations, guesses made plausible through artistry. The map's beauty concealed its uncertainty. By the 15th century, as navigation improved and printing spread, the repetition intensified. The new atlases of Ortelius Mercator and Bleu presented the world as a system of known quantities. Yet even they retained Tartaria. For these cartographers, the word was less an admission of ignorance than a placeholder for possibility. It marked a region not yet measured but too important to leave blank. The 17th century brought the first attempts at refinement. Travelers, missionaries, and traders from Russia and Western Europe began to cross the steppe. Their reports varied wildly. Some spoke of nomads, others of cities with walls and gardens. Few agreed on names or distances. For every account that shrank Tartaria's borders, another expanded them. The more data mapmakers received, the more uncertain the picture became. To reconcile these contradictions, cartographers turned to system. They divided the region into categories: Great Tartary in the north, Little Tartary in the west, Chinese, Tartary in the east. Each term implied order, but the borders were still conjecture. The map once again was drawing a world that did not yet exist. This was not deception. It was how knowledge functioned in the early modern era, part observation, part imagination. The map was a hypothesis rendered in ink. Each edition tested the previous one, but few questioned the foundation. The name Tartaria had become tradition. Even as exploration advanced, the word refused to fade. Jesuit missionaries in China and Siberia continued to use it in their letters to Rome. Merchants marked it on their shipping records. Natural philosophers referenced it in their studies of climate and magnetism. To them, Tartaria was a geographical fact, even if its limits were vague. And then, suddenly, it was gone. The shift occurred gradually but decisively during the early 19th century, when scientific cartography became a state enterprise. Imperial surveys replaced artistic conjecture. Measurements were taken with instruments rather than inherited from manuscripts. Russia, expanding eastward, cataloged its territories meticulously. What had been Great Tartary became Siberia. Independent Tartary became Central Asia. The undefined gave way to the administrative. From the perspective of empire, this was accuracy. From the perspective of history, it was transformation. A map that once represented imagination became a document of control. Where mystery once lay, there were now coordinates. But even as the new geography took hold, traces of the old one lingered. Scholars debate how much of Tartaria's image was based on genuine cultural memory. Some note parallels between the networks of trade described in Asian sources and the empire drawn by Europeans. Others argue that Tartaria was purely a projection, a mirror reflecting Europe's own uncertainties about its place in the world. Both views may hold truth. The puzzle of Tartaria is less about the territory itself than about the process of naming. When knowledge expands, it does not merely add new facts, it redefines the unknown. Each time a blank space is filled, something else is lost, the awareness that the blank existed at all. The disappearance of Tartaria marks one such loss. It is a reminder that the pursuit of precision often demands the sacrifice of wonder. Today, when researchers open those early atlases, they find more than geography. They find a record of perception, a snapshot of how humanity once organized mystery. The mapmakers who inscribed Tartaria across the top of Asia were not deceivers. They were storytellers with compasses translating rumor into geometry. Their error, if it can be called that, was believing that the act of drawing a line made it real. Modern technology allows us to see the world in ways those cartographers could not imagine. Satellites erase ambiguity. GPS defines every coordinate. Yet the old maps still exert a peculiar power. Their distortions remind us that every age draws the world it needs to see. The disappearance of Tartaria from our maps may not mean that the place was false. It may mean that we no longer need what it symbolized, the acknowledgement that vastness still exists. In the archives of Leiden, Paris, and St. Petersburg, researchers handling these fragile maps sometimes notice something curious. The paper, when tilted to the light, reveals traces of earlier drafts, faint outlines of mountains, erased borders, names crossed out and replaced. Each layer represents a moment in which the world was rewritten. Tartaria is not simply a lost region, it is a palimpsest of human certainty. To study it is to study how we build meaning out of ignorance. The name may have faded, but the impulse that created it persists. We still draw our own Tartaria's conceptual spaces, filled with what we cannot yet explain. Science calls them anomalies. Culture calls them myths. History calls them mistakes. But they all serve the same function, to remind us that the map, however accurate, is never the territory. If the map makers of the past once expanded the unknown into empire, modern civilization compresses it into data. Both are acts of imagination, though one admits it and the other does not. Tartaria, in this sense, is neither truth nor illusion. It is a record of how human perception oscillates between certainty and wonder. To follow its traces is to walk along the edge of knowledge itself, where the lines begin to blur and the paper turns blank. By the early 19th century, the world had decided it would no longer tolerate uncertainty. This was the age of precision, an era of instruments, coordinates, and systems designed to convert the planet into something measurable. The process reshaped everything: time, space, and even memory. And somewhere amid that reordering, the name Tartaria quietly disappeared. The Industrial Revolution did more than change machines. It changed perception. Steam telegraph and standardized time collapsed distance. For the first time in history, the pace of information matched the speed of empire. To govern this new world required a single map, one coherent version of reality. Ambiguity, once tolerated as a byproduct of exploration, became an obstacle. Cartography was no longer a craft practiced by scholars and artists. It was a science administered by states. Britain, France, and Russia each founded their own geographical societies, dedicated not merely to discovery, but to administration. Every new expedition carried surveyors trained to record the land in units, not legends. The undefined regions that had filled older atlases were redrawn into borders. The goal was not to imagine the world, it was to manage it. In that transformation, names mattered. Words that implied vastness or uncertainty were replaced by those that signaled control. Tartaria, once the shorthand for half of Asia, no longer fit the logic of empire. To the bureaucrats of St. Petersburg, London, and Paris, it was not a mystery, it was a redundancy. The territories it described had been catalogued, their rivers measured, their peoples classified. The undefined had been divided. The Russian Empire, expanding eastward across Siberia and Central Asia, played a central role in this redefinition. Its surveyors and military engineers produced thousands of maps, each more detailed than the last. What had been Great Tartaria on 18th century charts became Siberia. Independent Tartary fragmented into Turkestan, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. The old collective name dissolved into administrative fragments. From an imperial perspective, this was progress and active modernization. But progress has a cost. In replacing the broad with the precise, the world lost something intangible, the awareness that mystery existed at all. The disappearance of Tartaria was not an event, but a symptom of a larger transformation. It marked the moment when imagination yielded to measurement. Science and politics moved in parallel. The Enlightenment had taught Europe to distrust ambiguity, to see knowledge as a ladder rising from superstition to certainty. The new century believed it had reached the top. Geological surveys dated the Earth, ethnographers classified its peoples, astronomers fixed its position in the cosmos. Everything had its coordinate. What did not fit that grid was quietly omitted. To historians looking back, this period appears triumphant, a consolidation of human understanding. But every consolidation creates silence. The institutions that defined the modern world also defined what it would ignore. Languages, maps, and archives were standardized, and with that standardization came selection. A history that strives for coherence cannot afford contradictions. The erasure of Tartaria therefore fits into a broader pattern of refinement. The word did not vanish because of conspiracy or catastrophe. It vanished because it no longer served the story humanity was telling about itself. The new story was one of linear progress from chaos to order, myth to science, undefined to measured. Within that narrative, there was no room for an empire that had never been officially recorded. In the great libraries of Europe, the old maps were quietly replaced. Atlases that had once declared Great Tartary became curiosities. The archivists who removed them were not destroying history, they were updating it. To them, the old charts were obsolete products of an imprecise age. But obsolescence is a form of burial. When an artifact is no longer considered relevant, it slips out of view. Over time, neglect accomplishes what censorship cannot. The new atlases that emerged in the mid-19th century reflect this shift. They show the same landmass, the same rivers and mountains, but labeled differently. Each name corresponds to an imperial administration or colonial boundary. The aesthetic of the map changed too. Decorative frames gave way to clean lines, colors flattened into grids, artistry replaced by uniformity. The modern map was efficient, legible, and silent. It is tempting to see this silence as progress, yet silence always conceals choice. Each omission marks a decision about what knowledge should endure. The removal of Tartaria was not the deletion of a place, but the end of a worldview that accepted the coexistence of known and unknown. During the same decades, cities were being rebuilt in stone and steel. Railroads cut through mountains. Telegraph wires spanned oceans. The physical world began to mirror the conceptual one structured, connected, measurable. The undefined became rare. To live in this new world was to believe that everything could eventually be explained. And yet, even amid this confidence, unease remained. Writers and philosophers sensed that something was being lost. The Romantic poets mourned the vanishing of mystery. Historians began to wonder whether the pursuit of certainty might itself be a form of forgetting. The map, after all, had not become truer, only narrower. In some cases, traces of the old vocabulary persisted in unexpected ways. Travelers' diaries from the early 1800s still referred to the Tartarian steppe or Tartarian horses. Architects described Tartar motifs in design, a vague reference to Eastern ornament. The name lingered as an adjective, a ghost of a noun. It survived not as geography, but as memory. What makes this moment, the age of redefinition, so pivotal is that it reshaped not only how the world was described, but how it was imagined. The new map erased the frontier between reality and speculation. Once a name like Tartaria invited questions. After the redefinition, questions themselves became suspect. To ask about what had been erased was to risk appearing unscientific. The boundary between curiosity and heresy moved from theology to history. This psychological shift can still be felt today. Modern audiences raised in a culture of data and verification are trained to distrust the undefined. When confronted with gaps in the record, we assume error rather than mystery. But history is not a ledger. It is a narrative shaped by the priorities of those who record it. The age that believed it was clarifying the past may in fact have been editing it. The disappearance of Tartaria therefore reflects a paradox of progress. The more precisely we define the world, the less we perceive what lies beyond definition. Each act of naming closes a circle, turning possibility into fact. But facts once established harden. The imagination that once filled the maps with vastness now has nowhere to go. Looking back, it is difficult to say whether this transformation was inevitable. Every civilization refines its knowledge, and refinement always narrows the field. Yet something in the human spirit resists total closure. The continued fascination with lost worlds, hidden histories, and erased empires may be less about belief than about balance. The modern mind, confronted with perfect maps, still feels the need for an uncharted space. In that sense, Tartaria endures not as territory, but as a symbol of what every age must abandon to feel complete. It represents the margin where knowledge meets imagination, and where both must coexist for meaning to survive. By the end of the 19th century, the new order of the world was complete. Empires controlled not only land but time. Calendars, clocks, and languages were synchronized. The past was standardized into textbooks. What could not be verified was simply omitted. And yet the earth remained what it always had been, layered, uneven, full of remnants from older structures. Beneath the grids and boundaries of modernity lay foundations that did not fit the narrative of progress. In cities rebuilt after fire or conquest, walls of unfamiliar stone surfaced, their origins uncertain. The physical world still carried traces of forgotten design, even as the intellectual world declared them irrelevant. That tension between what is visible and what is remembered defines the next chapter of this story. The disappearance of Tartaria from maps may have closed a conceptual frontier, but the evidence of older foundations kept reopening it. The question moved from paper to stone. Every city is built on another. Beneath the foundations of the present, the remains of earlier streets, walls, and lives persist, buried under the weight of progress. The ground remembers even when the mind does not. Archaeologists have a word for this layering stratigraphy, the vertical record of human existence. Each layer marks an era, a reconstruction, a forgetting. And among those layers across continents, similar patterns appear: doors that open into earth windows, below street-level fragments of older architecture reused as foundations. These are not isolated curiosities. They are the material counterpart to the conceptual disappearance traced in earlier maps. As the 19th century redefined the world from imagination into measurement, cities themselves became archives of that transformation. In their basements and subfloors lie the physical evidence of what came before, preserved not by intention but by inertia. Consider St. Petersburg, a city celebrated as one of Europe's youngest, yet built with the confidence of antiquity. Officially founded in 1703 by Peter the Great, it was said to rise from marshland, a triumph of will over nature. But the city's oldest stones tell a subtler story. Excavations during routine construction have revealed doors and windows buried several meters below the current ground line. Some facades appear to continue downward, their lower floors sealed by layers of compacted soil. Builders call this subsidence, the natural sinking of ground over time. Others suspect something else, that the earliest city may have been partially unearthed rather than entirely built. Similar anomalies appear elsewhere. In Paris, the reconstruction of the 19th century haussmanns, grand boulevards covered over older neighborhoods, but beneath them, the catacombs expand far beyond the mapped ossuaries. Beneath London, New York, and Chicago, construction crews frequently encounter masonry older than the city plans themselves, arches, corridors, and sealed chambers that have no documented origin. Most are dismissed as forgotten basements or remnants of demolished structures. Yet their precision, uniformity, and distribution suggest a broader pattern. It is tempting to romanticize such discoveries, to imagine secret civilizations or deliberate concealment. But perhaps the truth is quieter. Cities are organisms that consume their own past. Every era builds upon the debris of the last, reusing materials, leveling ruins, or simply covering them. The result is an urban geology, each layer both erasure and preservation. When we look down into those layers, we are not necessarily seeing something mysterious. We are seeing time made visible. Still, questions linger. Why do so many cities show similar patterns of burial, as if the earth had risen suddenly rather than gradually? Historical accounts sometimes mention floods, fires, or reconstruction projects, but rarely on the scale implied by the buried structures. In some cases, entire street levels appear to have been replaced. The old city lies a story or two below the new. In the American Midwest, the city of Chicago provides one of the most documented examples. Following the Great Fire of 1871, engineers famously razed entire buildings to install modern sewers. Yet photographs taken before the fire already show streets being elevated above existing structures. The cause officially was sanitation. The swampy ground demanded higher drainage. Unofficially, observers noted that the so-called basements resembled ground floors of earlier buildings. Whether coincidence or continuity, the effect is the same: an older world sealed beneath a newer one. The same phenomenon recurs across Europe. Prague, Edinburgh, and Naples each have underground streets now open to tourist levels that once lay at the surface. In some cases, natural disasters buried them. In others, urban planning did. But the repetition of form is striking: arches, vaulted ceilings, stone stairways descending into darkness. Each layer feels like a mirror of the one above, slightly smaller, slightly older. Architectural historians approach these mysteries with caution. They note that changes in elevation are common when cities rebuild after floods or fires. New foundations are laid atop debris rather than clearing it. Over centuries, the process accumulates. Yet what draws attention is not the existence of buried layers, but their persistence and design. Many of these substructures exhibit craftsmanship equal to or greater than the buildings above them. Their proportions follow geometric ratios found in classical architecture ratios that often predate the official founding of the city. In some sites, materials complicate the timeline. Stones of types unavailable locally, mortars with unidentifiable composition, and bricks fired at temperatures difficult to achieve with the technology of the claimed period. These details do not prove alternative histories, but they challenge the simplicity of the official one. They remind us that what we call modern often rests literally on what we cannot yet explain. Perhaps this is why the buried city continues to fascinate. It offers a tangible metaphor for history itself, a structure that accumulates meaning by covering it. The layers below are not secrets in the conspiratorial sense. They are expressions of continuity. Yet continuity can be unsettling. It suggests that the line between past and present is thinner than we prefer to believe. The study of substructures reveals another paradox destruction often preserves. When a city collapses or burns, its ruins are buried under debris, sealing them from weather and time. The new city built above becomes both memorial and disguise. Future generations digging foundations rediscover fragments of their own forgotten beginnings. In that sense, the earth functions as both witness and editor. Urban archaeologists sometimes describe their work as reading a book written in reverse. Each excavation begins with the newest page, the asphalt of the present, and turns backward one layer at a time. What emerges is not a single story, but a collage of revisions. Streets shift, walls are rebuilt, names change. And through it all, the human pattern persists: construction as remembrance and oblivion at once. The buried layers also reveal how memory is shaped by survival. Structures that endure are those built too solidly to destroy. Stone walls beneath modern foundations are often the most resilient parts of the city, enduring floods, fires, and political change. They are the unconscious architecture of civilization, the parts designed to support, not to be seen. Their persistence creates the illusion that history has direction, when in truth it only has depth. If one stands in the lower vaults of St. Petersburg or the tunnels beneath Paris, the air itself carries the sensation of time compressed. These spaces are neither fully past nor present. They are intervals, pauses between eras. In their silence lies the residue of countless decisions: what to keep, what to replace, what to forget. From a philosophical perspective, the buried city challenges the modern belief in progress. It shows that every act of creation contains an element of concealment. To build a new foundation, one must cover an old one. Progress, then, may not be ascent, but sedimentation, a layering of intentions that eventually obscures their origins. This idea extends beyond architecture. Societies, too, are built in layers. Political systems, languages, and ideologies accumulate upon earlier forms, absorbing them while pretending to replace them. The past does not vanish, it becomes infrastructure. We walk on it daily, unaware that it still holds the shape of what came before. In that sense, the buried city becomes a metaphor for collective memory. What we remember consciously is only the visible surface. Beneath it lies the structure that makes remembering possible. The foundations of modern identity, nation, progress, rationality rest on older strata of myth and imagination. The disappearance of Tartaria from maps may reflect not suppression, but stratification, an older concept buried under newer ones, still supporting them invisibly. Archaeology often begins with accidents. A subway excavation reveals an ancient wall. A flood exposes a forgotten corridor. Each discovery interrupts the illusion of completeness. It reminds us that the world is unfinished, that the present is only the latest layer of a deeper construction. For those who listen carefully, these interruptions are invitations to re-examine, not to romanticize, to question, not to conclude. Whether the buried cities represent lost civilizations or simply the inevitable sediment of time, their message is the same: history is cumulative, not linear. The earth beneath our feet is an archive more honest than our books. It records without interpretation, preserves without preference. We in turn interpret its silence according to what we are ready to hear. Perhaps the fascination with hidden layers is not about discovering new truths, but about rediscovering scale. To realize that our moment is one stratum among many is to regain perspective. The modern city with its glass towers and digital networks may one day be just another layer, buried, silent, and inexplicable to those who come after. For now, the buried architecture serves as both foundation and reminder. It supports our daily lives while whispering that nothing built on forgetting remains stable forever. Eventually, the ground shifts, the walls crack, and the past surfaces again, asking to be acknowledged. If one looks down from the air or now from a satellite, certain shapes emerge from the ground like echoes. They are precise, symmetrical, and strangely familiar star-shaped fortresses, circular bastions, radiating grids. From Europe to Asia, from the Americas to Africa, these forms recur, separated by oceans, yet bound by geometry. Historians call them star forts, a military innovation of the Renaissance, born in Italy and spread by empire. Yet the more they are studied, the less simple their story becomes. Their perfection of form, their global repetition, and their alignment with older settlements raise a question that cannot be answered easily. How does the same geometry appear everywhere across centuries, as if humanity were tracing an invisible template? The conventional history begins in the 15th century. As artillery made medieval walls obsolete, European engineers devised new fortifications that could resist cannon fire. They replaced high vertical walls with low angular bastions designed to deflect projectiles and provide overlapping fields of defense. The result was the Trace Italienne, a fortress shaped like a star, its symmetry both functional and beautiful. From Italy, the design spread rapidly. Spain, France, and the Netherlands refined it, turning geometry into empire. Each colony carried the blueprint abroad to India, to the Caribbean, to North America. The star-shaped citadel became a signature of modernity. Its purpose was military, but its effect was aesthetic, cities built around perfect order. At least that is the textbook account. Yet when historians trace the spread of these designs, inconsistencies appear. Some star-like fortresses predate the supposed origin of the Trace Italienne. Others stand in places that were never European colonies. Their dimensions and proportions often mirror one another with uncanny precision, even when separated by vast cultural and technological gaps. In India, the fort of Muruganjira displays the same radiating pattern as Palmanova in Italy, though built centuries apart. In the Americas, the fortress of San Juan de Ulua in Mexico and the citadel of Quebec share nearly identical layouts. In Africa, remnants of polygonal defenses line the coasts of Ghana and Mozambique. And in Siberia, archaeologists have mapped geometric earthworks whose design evokes the same principles. Mainstream scholarship attributes these similarities to diffusion, the movement of ideas through trade, conquest, and imitation. Military engineers circulated across continents. Drawings and manuals were exchanged. Empires competed by copying one another. In this view, the geometry of the star fort reflects not mystery, but efficiency, a universal response to the physics of defense. Still, some patterns extend beyond practical necessity. Many forts exhibit alignments with celestial axes or nearby waterways, their bastions pointing towards solstices or magnetic north. Some share proportions that correspond to harmonic ratios found in music and architecture, ratios long associated with the idea of cosmic order. These details may be coincidental, or they may reveal an aesthetic tradition older than recorded engineering. What is certain is that geometry carries meaning. A fortress is more than a structure of war. It is a statement of control over space. To impose a geometric form upon the landscape is to declare mastery over nature and symbolically over chaos. The star with its radiating symmetry embodies this ideal. It transforms irregular terrain into a diagram of intention. The appeal of the star pattern lies in its dual nature, functional and metaphysical. It is both a defense mechanism and a mandala. In some cultures, the same form appears in sacred architecture, where it represents harmony between heaven and earth. Cathedrals, mosques, and temples echo the same ratios, as if geometry were a language shared across civilizations. Whether the recurrence of these forms reflects shared knowledge or parallel invention remains debated. Historians generally caution against assuming connection where adaptation suffices. Yet even adaptation implies a kind of convergence, different minds arriving independently at the same solution to different problems. When geometry repeats, it may reveal less about influence than about the universal logic of perception. Mathematicians note that the star fort embodies principles of fractal efficiency, maximum coverage with minimal exposure. Its structure distributes force evenly, much like natural formations, crystals, snowflakes, or shells. Perhaps the repetition across history arises not from communication, but from the constraints of physics and the tendencies of the human mind. To build defensively is to think geometrically, and yet the emotional resonance of these shapes extends beyond function. When viewed from above, star forts inspire not fear, but fascination. Their symmetry evokes calm rather than conflict. They appear as deliberate works of art embedded in the earth. That aesthetic persistence suggests that something deeper than utility guided their creation. In some places, these patterns survive even after their military relevance has vanished. Palma Nova in Italy, once a fortress, now thrives as a living town, its streets still radiating from a central plaza. From the ground, the geometry is invisible. From the sky, it is perfect. The same is true for Naarden in the Netherlands, for Goryokaku in Japan, for Louisbourg in Canada. What began as defense became design. Urban planners of the Enlightenment admired these forms, seeing in them the possibility of rational city settlements that mirrored the order of the cosmos. The radiating plan became a model for utopia, a society arranged by reason rather than accident. Over time, that ideal softened into nostalgia. The star shape moved from fortress to garden, from geometry of control to geometry of beauty. In this transformation lies another story, the shift from the tangible to the symbolic. The same pattern that once guarded empires now decorates parks and plazas. The fort became metaphor. Its geometry survived because it spoke to something timeless, the human desire to impose meaning upon landscape. What complicates this picture are the outlier structures whose age or isolation resists explanation. Archaeological surveys in Central Asia, for example, have revealed polygonal earthworks that predate modern fortification theory by centuries. In South America, certain pre-Columbian sites exhibit geometric precision that parallels Renaissance ideals. Whether these similarities indicate influence, coincidence, or something we have yet to recognize remains open. The caution, as always, is to resist projection. It is easy to see patterns and infer intention. But the value of such study lies not in certainty, but in awareness, the recognition that geometry, like language, connects across distance and time. Even if each culture invented its own version independently, the recurrence itself testifies to a shared impulse to translate the chaos of the natural world into a form that can be understood. Viewed this way, the geometry that repeats is not evidence of conspiracy or forgotten science. It is evidence of continuity. Across civilizations, humans have sought to encode stability in form. The circle, the square, the star each reappears whenever societies attempt to reconcile the finite with the infinite. Modern satellite imagery has made this recurrence visible on a scale earlier ages could not imagine. When the patterns are mapped together, they form a global constellation of intention, a network not of communication but of coincidence, perhaps even of instinct. The Earth seen from above resembles a palimpsest of human geometry, each age inscribing its own version atop the last. What is striking is how enduring these shapes remain even after their meanings fade. Tourists walk through old fortresses without recognizing the mathematics beneath their feet. City planners reuse their layouts without recalling their origins. The pattern survives because it is functional, but also because it is familiar. Geometry becomes habit. Perhaps the repetition reveals less about history and more about perception itself. The mind finds comfort in symmetry. It reads purpose into order. Whether the builders intended cosmic symbolism or mere practicality may never be known. The star shape endures because it satisfies both the need to defend and the need to design. To trace these forms is to follow a quiet thread through time, a reminder that history, like architecture, builds upon inherited foundations. The fortresses of one age become the parks of another. The geometry that repeats is not a secret code, but a dialogue across centuries written in stone and soil. As with the buried cities, the value lies not in proving connection, but in recognizing continuity. Every age leaves its mark in shapes that reflect how it understood the world. When those shapes recur, they suggest that understanding may be cyclical, not linear, that humanity returns again and again to the same forms because those forms mirror something within us. Fire has always been both destroyer and creator. In myth, it purifies. In history, it rebuilds. The 19th century, remembered as the age of industry and progress, was also an age of fire. Cities burned sometimes by accident, sometimes by neglect, and sometimes through forces still debated. The pattern is difficult to ignore. In the span of less than 100 years, nearly every major metropolis of the modern world was remade by flame. Historians list them as separate events, each with its own cause and aftermath. Yet when placed side by side, they form a strange kind of chronology, a century that seemed to clear its own foundations before building anew. Moscow in 1812, Hamburg in 1842, Chicago in 1871, Boston in 1872, San Francisco in 1906. The names differ, but the images converge: streets glowing red against smoke, churches collapsing into embers, and by morning plans for reconstruction already underway. The most famous of these, the Great Chicago Fire, began on an October night in 1871. The official narrative blames a spark in a barn fanned by dry winds into a conflagration that consumed the wooden city. Within 2 days, over 17,000 buildings were gone. Yet what followed was not paralysis, but acceleration. In less than a decade, a new city rose, rebuilt in brick, steel, and stone. Architects from across the world came to experiment with height and structure. Out of ashes emerged the modern skyscraper. Other fires tell similar stories. In Hamburg, flames swept through the medieval core in 1842, clearing space for a modern port. In Moscow, Napoleon's invasion coincided with a fire that erased much of the city's wooden architecture, making way for a new imperial style. In San Francisco, the 1906 earthquake and subsequent fires reduced entire districts to rubble, only for them to reappear as a planned grid of boulevards and civic monuments. To call these disasters fortunate would trivialize their human cost. Tens of thousands lost homes and lives. Yet viewed from a structural perspective, the destruction accelerated urban renewal on a scale that peaceful planning rarely achieves. Scholars of architecture note that fire acted as a form of forced modernization, a brutal editor reshaping cities into the language of industry. Whether this pattern was coincidence or consequence remains open to interpretation. The 19th century was volatile by nature, cities where dense lighting was open flame, and infrastructure primitive. Fires were inevitable. At the same time, industrial society possessed both the will and the technology to rebuild rapidly. Each reconstruction became an opportunity to redefine identity. The pattern that emerges is less about the cause of fire than about its function. In the symbolic economy of modernity, destruction cleared the page. The old aesthetic, ornate, irregular, tied to local traditions, gave way to uniformity. Brick replaced wood, steel replaced stone, grid replaced labyrinth. What had once been organic became geometric, measurable, efficient. Urban historians often speak of the clean slate. Fire, they argue, provided cities with a tabula rasa upon which to project modern ideals. The old quarters, shaped by centuries of adaptation, were too tangled for sanitation, too narrow for commerce. Reconstruction allowed not only new materials, but new hierarchies. Straight roads replaced winding alleys. Government centers displaced markets. Cities became instruments of administration rather than memory. But there is also another dimension, psychological rather than practical. Each fire symbolized more than destruction. It was a kind of ritual in which the collective past was consumed so that the future could appear unburdened. The impulse to rebuild quickly, to erase traces of loss, reflects a deeper human tendency to equate renewal with forgetting. Writers of the time recognized this paradox. In the aftermath of the Chicago fire, newspapers described the ruins as majestic in their desolation. Pain and awe coexisted. The spectacle of destruction became a canvas for imagination. Artists painted the ruins not as tragedy, but as transition. The same aesthetic appears in literature: ruins that glow, ashes that promise rebirth. Progress, it seemed, required a moment of annihilation. In the broader context of the 19th century, this pattern aligns with the spirit of transformation that defined the age. Steam and electricity had already dissolved the boundaries of time and space. Now fire dissolved those of history. What emerged was a civilization confident in its ability to start over again and again. Yet the speed of renewal carried its own cost. The layers of history that once accumulated organically were now removed intentionally. The result was a flattening of memory. Cities lost not only their physical pasts, but their sense of continuity. To walk through their new avenues was to inhabit a world that seemed both ancient and brand new, a replica of itself purified of context. Architectural critics later called this the birth of modernism, simplicity over ornament, function over form. But the roots of that aesthetic lie in the ashes of fire. The clean lines of modern architecture began as literal cleansings. What fire destroyed, rational planning completed. The irregular textures of human life were replaced by precision. It is tempting to read this as destiny, as if civilization were designed to burn its own history every few centuries. But patterns can deceive. Each fire had its own causes, its own circumstances. Still, the repetition invites reflection. Why does humanity rebuild the same way each time, smoother, straighter, more uniform? Perhaps because each reconstruction carries an implicit denial that what came before was necessary and that chaos can be conquered through design. The irony is that fire, uncontrolled by nature, became the agent of control. It stripped cities of individuality while enabling standardization. After the fires, architectural manuals circulated globally. Engineers shared models. Urban planners spoke of universal solutions. In a sense, the modern world was forged not by conquest or invention alone, but by catastrophe accepted as opportunity. From a historical standpoint, this reconfiguration of cities also reconfigured perception. Where once the urban landscape reflected layers of time, Roman beneath Gothic, beneath Baroque, the new metropolises compressed all eras into one, the present. Memory was no longer built into the streets. It was archived elsewhere in museums and textbooks. The city became an image of progress rather than a record of survival. In that transformation, something intangible vanished. The texture of age, the slow accumulation of imperfection, gave way to smoothness. Fires did not merely erase buildings. They erased irregularity, the visible dialogue between past and present. Modernity's brightness left few shadows. Yet the ground beneath these reconstructed cities still carries the imprint of what came before. In Chicago, beneath the skyscrapers, archaeologists have found layers of burnt timber and melted glass, the fossils of a vanished city. In San Francisco, certain foundations of pre-1906 houses remain buried under newer streets. The earth preserves what history overwrote. Some historians describe the 19th century as an era obsessed with self-correction. Every disaster rather than a warning became proof of progress. To rebuild was to demonstrate mastery over fate. But mastery is a fragile illusion. Fire continues to remind humanity that order and destruction are intertwined. The same energy that fuels innovation can, under other circumstances, consume it. Looking back, one might see the century's great fires as metaphors for civilization's larger process, periodic purification. Each blaze, intentional or accidental, erased complexity and invited a new beginning. Whether this cycle was inevitable or chosen remains uncertain. What is clear is that it aligned perfectly with the psychological needs of the age, the desire for clarity, the fear of decay, the faith in renewal. By the early 20th century, the pattern had completed itself. The industrial city stood as a monument to rebirth, gleaming with steel and glass. But within that gleam lingered an absence, the silence of what had been consumed. The memory of fire lives not in the new buildings, but in the absence of what they replaced. Every era constructs its own mythology of progress. For the 19th century, that mythology was written in flame. Fire became both symbol and mechanism, erasing irregularities, leveling hierarchies, and offering the illusion of control. What remained after the smoke cleared was not merely a new city, but a new idea of what civilization should look like: efficient, symmetrical, and forgetful. By the end of the 19th century, the fires had cooled, but the desire to rebuild burned brighter than ever. Cities once scarred by destruction now competed to prove their mastery over chaos, not through survival, but through spectacle. The industrial age had given humanity the power to construct entire worlds at will, and it chose to do so again and again in miniature. These were the World's Fair's vast exhibitions of architecture, invention, and ideology, Temporary utopias meant to summarize civilization itself. The first of these grand expositions took place in London in 1851 under the glittering glass canopy of the Crystal Palace. Designed by Joseph Paxton, it was both building and metaphor, a transparent cathedral to progress assembled in months and dismantled in weeks. Inside, nations displayed their technologies, their arts, their wealth. For the first time, the industrial world saw itself reflected not as fragments, but as a single narrative of advancement. The success of London set a pattern the rest of the century would follow. Paris, Vienna, Philadelphia, Chicago, St. Louis, each fair larger than the last, each more ambitious. Their architecture was a paradox of grandeur and impermanence. Palaces rose out of nothing, glowing with electric light, their facades carved in plaster and painted to resemble marble. They were monuments designed to disappear. At the heart of each exposition lay the same message: progress was the new permanence. The old material, stone, brick, wood, gave way to steel and glass. The temporary nature of the fairs did not diminish their significance, it amplified it. They embodied the belief that civilization could rebuild itself endlessly, that transience was a mark of vitality, not decay. Historians sometimes describe these fairs as theaters of modernity. They presented the world as both artifact and performance. Visitors walked through pavilions that recreated entire nations. Egypt beside France, China beside Britain, compressed into idealized form. The geography of the earth was reorganized into an exhibition each culture staged as a scene in the story of human progress. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago epitomized this phenomenon. Built on the shores of Lake Michigan, it was a city of white palaces, canals, and boulevards, so immaculate that visitors called it the White City. Its symmetry and order echoed the star-shaped fortresses of earlier centuries, though the purpose had changed. This was not a defense against invasion, but against disorder itself. The White City was a vision of civilization purified, clean, rational, self-contained. And yet, like all the others, it was temporary. Within a year, most of its gleaming facades were gone, dismantled or destroyed by fire. The ephemerality was deliberate. The city's perfection could not survive permanence. It was meant to exist only as impression, not as place. For many observers, that transience held meaning. It suggested that progress itself was a performance, convincing precisely because it was fleeting. Architects and planners drew inspiration from these temporary cities for decades to come. The Beaux Arts style that dominated early 20th century civic buildings traces directly to the world's fairs. Government edifices, museums, train stations all carried echoes of those plaster palaces. Even as the original structures vanished, their ideals endured: harmony, order, and the spectacle of control. The fairs were not just architectural experiments, they were instruments of memory and amnesia. They condensed the achievements of the age into tangible form, then erased them, leaving behind photographs, pamphlets, and nostalgia. To attend was to participate in a ritual of collective reinvention, an affirmation that humanity could start over whenever it wished. Sociologists who study these events note that they coincided with a global shift in perception. The 19th century's faith in progress depended on visible proof, and the world's fairs provided it. They were laboratories of imagination where industry became art and consumption became identity. But they also revealed a tension: the faster civilization built, the less it remembered. Each exposition presented the future as something entirely new, detached from the ruins it stood upon. Perhaps that was their unspoken function: to overwrite the past, to transform history into exhibition. Visitors walking through the old world villages or colonial streets of these fairs were not encountering authenticity. They were witnessing curated nostalgia, a version of history domesticated by design. The fairs did not preserve memory, they repackaged it for display. In this sense, they continued the same logic that had followed the Great Fires. Destruction had made room for reconstruction. The fairs made reconstruction into entertainment. Both replaced continuity with spectacle. The difference was only in tone. Where fire erased, the exposition idealized. Both produced the same effect: a clean surface. It is striking how the architecture of these temporary cities mirrored the buried cities beneath the real ones. The same symmetry, the same monumental facades, the same absence of wear. The difference was that the fairs were honest about their impermanence. They never pretended to be eternal. They were dreams built on scaffolds, their beauty designed to vanish. Some scholars see in this an early form of the virtual, a constructed reality meant to evoke emotion rather than endure. The fairgrounds were immersive worlds, carefully choreographed experiences of awe. To walk through them was to step into a vision of history edited for optimism. Everything inconvenient, poverty, conflict, decay was kept outside the gates. Inside, civilization appeared seamless, whole, inevitable. And yet the images that survive the photographs of glowing domes reflected in artificial lakes carry a quiet melancholy. The light feels fragile, as if aware of its own short life. The same structures that embodied progress also revealed its cost detachment from the tangible, the slow replacement of substance with appearance. The demolition of these great expositions was often as deliberate as their construction. After the 1900 Paris Exposition pavilions were dismantled overnight, in St. Louis in 1904, entire avenues were cleared within months. What had taken years to plan and build vanished without protest. The world accepted their disappearance as part of the ritual. In retrospect, these acts of removal appear almost symbolic. They reflect a civilization learning to treat architecture and perhaps history itself as temporary media. The modern world would inherit this logic, building and demolishing at an ever-accelerating pace. What the World's Fair's rehearsed globalization performed, yet not everything faded. Certain elements of the fair's architecture persisted in the collective imagination. The electric lighting that astonished visitors became a staple of modern urban life. The monumental scale influenced civic design across continents. Even the idea of gathering the world's knowledge into one space, once architectural, now digital, echoes the same impulse. The fairgrounds were prototypes for the information age, temporary worlds that made complexity visible, if only for a moment. To study the world's fairs today is to glimpse the psychology of an era that believed it could display reality itself. Each pavilion was a statement of confidence, yet also a confession of fragility. The more perfectly these cities were built, the more quickly they vanished. Perhaps that is why they remain haunting. They represent humanity's attempt to construct permanence out of impermanence, to prove mastery by erasing evidence of effort. The photographs of the White City still circulate, their brightness undimmed by time. But to look closely is to notice the absence of texture, the smoothness that comes from plaster, painted as marble, the illusion of solidity that hides its own temporariness. What we see is a memory of perfection that never existed. In this way, the fairs embody the paradox of the modern age: to preserve by replacing, to remember by rebuilding, to celebrate permanence through things that cannot last. They are both monuments and mirages, revealing that the line between progress and performance has always been thin. As night fell on the final evenings of these expositions, visitors described the same experience. The lights reflected on the water orchestras played, and the crowd stood silent, aware that the city would soon vanish. For a brief moment, the illusion of unity, the sense that all nations, all histories, could coexist in one luminous space, felt real. Then the lamps were extinguished, and the fair became history. What remained was the feeling that civilization had witnessed itself not as it was, but as it wished to be. Every civilization leaves traces beneath itself. Below the rhythm of modern streets lies a world of silence, tunnels, chambers, vaults, and conduits that mirror the cities above. Most were built for practical reasons: to carry water, to transport goods, to shelter the living or the dead. Yet over time, as surface life changed, these spaces acquired a second identity. They became the subconscious of civilization, its buried memory. When we speak of modernity, we imagine progress rising upward, towers, bridges, skylines. But progress also digs downward. Each century adds another layer to the underworld, a sediment of intention and abandonment. Engineers document these structures as infrastructure. Archaeologists encounter them as mystery. Between those two perspectives lies the space where history forgets and memory persists. Paris offers perhaps the most famous example. Beneath its orderly boulevards stretches a labyrinth of tunnels carved from ancient quarries. Over the centuries, the network was repurposed, first for mining, then for storage, later for burial. The catacombs, holding millions of human remains, represent only a small fraction of the total. Deeper levels remain sealed, mapped only in fragments. Some tunnels intersect perfectly with the foundations of churches and monuments, above as if the surface city were aligned to an older geometry. Whether by design or coincidence, the effect is haunting, a double city, one luminous, one shadowed. London has its own layers: Roman walls, medieval cellars, Victorian sewers, and abandoned tube stations. During the expansion of the underground, workers repeatedly encountered older passages, brick-lined corridors that led nowhere, vaults filled with silt stairways ending in blank walls. Most were destroyed or sealed. The records, if they existed, rarely survived. Yet the pattern repeats beneath order residue. In New York, construction crews digging for subways in the early 20th century unearthed stone arches and tunnels inconsistent with surrounding foundations. Officially, they were remnants of earlier utilities or basements. Unofficially, they fed the same curiosity that once surrounded the word Tartaria, the idea that the past might be larger than the story we have told about it. To scholars, these discoveries illustrate a simple truth: cities grow like coral, layer upon layer. Each generation builds on the remnants of the last, sometimes literally. To live in a metropolis is to stand on the compressed remains of others who did the same. The material beneath our feet is not empty earth, but accumulated architecture, a continuous negotiation between construction and decay. Yet the global consistency of these subterranean forms invites broader reflection. The tunnels of Paris, the vaults of Rome, the cisterns of Istanbul, the catacombs of Lima, though separated by geography and culture, they share certain characteristics: symmetry, endurance, and a sense of design that transcends function. Many are aligned with rivers or natural aquifers. Some follow geometric grids that mirror the streets above. Others remain unexplained, their purpose forgotten. Historians interpret this recurrence pragmatically. Ancient builders, constrained by physics, reuse proven methods. Stone arches and barrel vaults, for instance, distribute weight efficiently. Their similarity across cultures reflects necessity rather than communication. Yet the persistence of form also suggests a deeper continuity, a shared understanding of how to shape space for permanence. The underworld of architecture has always carried symbolic weight. In myth, descent signifies knowledge. Orpheus, Inanna, and Dante all journey below to encounter truth stripped of illusion. Perhaps that metaphor survives unconsciously in the structures we build. The lower levels of city cellars, subway service tunnels, contain not only utilities, but the collective fear and fascination with what lies beneath. Modern infrastructure extends this metaphor into technology. Electrical conduits, fiber optic cables, and subway lines weave a hidden web connecting the world. Like the roots of a tree, this network sustains what is visible without revealing itself. Some urban theorists compare it to a nervous system, a distributed intelligence that allows the city to sense and respond. What began as stone and brick has evolved into data and current, yet the principle remains the same: civilization depends on what it buries. When viewed through time, this subterranean continuity blurs the distinction between past and present. The ancient aqueduct and the modern sewer belong to the same lineage, unseen infrastructures that define the possible. Their invisibility gives them power. Because they are out of sight, they are rarely questioned. In this sense, the underworld is not only physical, but political. It represents the systems that sustain order precisely because they remain hidden. Archaeology often reveals how much can persist unnoticed. In 2013, while renovating a street in Rome, workers broke into a chamber containing intact mosaics and frescoes sealed for nearly 2 millennia. In Turkey, construction of a new subway line uncovered an entire underground city beneath Nevşehir tunnels, rooms, and stairways extending for miles. Each discovery reminds us that the boundary between the living city and the dead one is only a matter of depth. Engineers sometimes encounter the same lesson in reverse. During the excavation of new transit systems, unexplained voids appear, spaces not on any map. The pragmatic response is to fill them with concrete and proceed. Yet those sealed spaces linger in blueprints as negative-shaped silent witnesses to forgotten design. In this way, the modern world continues to bury the old, not through malice but through efficiency. To imagine the totality of this underground network is to glimpse a parallel civilization, a negative image of the world above. It has its own architecture, its own geography, even its own weather. Air moves differently there, temperature remains constant, sound carries further. Some explorers describe the sensation as temporal dislocation, as if each step downward moves not just through space but through time. The fascination with these depths is not new. In every age, people have projected meaning onto what lies beneath. Medieval alchemists believed the earth itself was alive, its interior veins carrying metals like blood. Enlightenment thinkers saw in underground structures the metaphor of the subconscious layers of thought buried beneath reason. In our own time, data centers and server farms, often located below ground, continue the tradition. The more advanced our civilization becomes, the deeper it digs. Yet the deeper we go, the more we encounter reminders of what we have forgotten. A wall built into older masonry, a tunnel following a path no longer visible above. Each discovery hints at continuity without context. We inherit foundations whose builders we cannot name, and on them we construct new meanings. Perhaps that is what civilization is, a series of translations, from material to material, from one form of silence to another. To speak of the subterranean network as mystery is less to suggest conspiracy than to acknowledge scale. The true enormity of what lies beneath cities is beyond individual comprehension. It is both artifact and organism, a record of human persistence written in negative space. What we call underground is not a separate world, but the world's memory of itself. For historians, the challenge is interpretation. How does one read architecture that was never meant to be seen? Each tunnel and chamber is a sentence without subject, a fragment of a language we still speak but no longer understand. The temptation is to fill the gaps with narrative, to imagine hidden societies or forgotten technologies. But the silence of stone resists such projection. Its meaning lies not in answers, but in endurance. Still, the parallels are difficult to ignore. The repetition of form from the catacombs of Rome to the subways of Tokyo suggests that humanity's relationship with the underworld is constant. Whether building tombs, storage vaults, or digital infrastructure, we reproduce the same geometry: arches, grids, corridors. Perhaps the form itself arises from necessity, perhaps from memory older than history. In the end, what connects these spaces is not mystery, but continuity. The network beneath the modern world is both inheritance and metaphor, a reminder that progress does not erase the past, but rests upon it. Each time we build deeper, we echo the gestures of those who did the same centuries before. The tools have changed. The instinct has not. To descend into these tunnels is to enter the material equivalent of the forgotten. It is to confront the idea that civilization, for all its upward aspiration, is anchored in darkness. The deeper we go, the more we find that the ground is not a boundary but a mirror. Every civilization forgets on purpose. The process is rarely violent, rarely declared. It happens quietly through repetition, through revision, through the slow replacement of memory with order. Forgetting, like architecture, has its blueprints. It requires structure, maintenance, and intent. When a city buries its older layers, when a map replaces an old name, when a library reorganizes its shelves, the act is the same: selective remembrance. What is preserved defines what is lost. The shape of history is therefore not only the result of discovery, but of design. Human memory functions in a similar way. Psychologists describe forgetting as adaptive, a mechanism that allows the mind to prioritize what is necessary for survival. Societies seem to do the same. They build institutions that organize experience into manageable narratives. Those narratives simplify the past so that the present can feel coherent. The complexity that remains unfit for the story is archived, ignored, or overwritten. The 19th century, which once called itself the Age of Progress, was also an age of forgetting. As industrial civilization expanded, it curated its own past. The world's archives, museums, and universities, symbols of preservation, were also tools of omission. What they collected shaped what would be remembered. What they excluded defined the rest as myth. Historians sometimes refer to this as the canonization of knowledge. Like religion, the modern worldview established its scriptures, textbooks, maps, timelines, classifications. They did not need to destroy older ideas. They only needed to render them irrelevant. A forgotten fact is not one that has been erased, it is one that no longer fits. The architecture of forgetting thus begins with confidence. Each era believes it has finally understood what came before. That certainty justifies pruning, simplification, and silence. The archives expand, but the horizon narrows. Progress depends not only on what is learned, but on what is set aside. This mechanism is not sinister, it is structural. To function, every collective memory must exclude. Yet the exclusions accumulate, forming blind spots large enough to hold entire civilizations. When the word Tartaria vanished from maps, for instance, it was not through decree but through neglect. Once removed from textbooks and official discourse, it ceased to exist for those who never saw it. The erasure was complete because it was invisible. Sociologists describe such processes as institutional forgetting. They occur whenever knowledge becomes formalized. The more efficiently information is organized, the easier it becomes to discard what lies outside the system. The result is stability at the cost of possibility. Archives demonstrate this paradox vividly. They are built to preserve, yet preservation itself can be a form of burial. A document locked in a climate-controlled vault may survive physically, but vanish culturally. Its meaning depends on being read, and reading depends on context. Without context, memory decays into artifact. The same principle applies to urban memory. When a historic district is restored, the restoration often replaces what was spontaneous with what is curated. The city becomes a museum of itself, preserving not its history, but an image of its history. In that sense, conservation and forgetting are not opposites, but stages of the same process. Both produce distance between the present and what came before. Language plays its part as well. Words disappear when they cease to be useful. Each time a term falls out of circulation, a concept fades with it. The disappearance of names like Tartaria, Hyperborea, or Cathay illustrates this phenomenon. Their loss was linguistic before it was historical. Once a name no longer anchors imagination, the idea it carried dissolves. Education completes the process. To teach history is to define its limits. Children learn timelines that begin and end with events chosen for clarity, not complexity. This simplification is necessary, but it also trains perception. The mind learns to associate the absence of information with the absence of reality. What is not taught becomes unthinkable. In this way, forgetting becomes an institution, one reinforced by progress itself. Each generation inherits a world already organized by the assumptions of the last. Even revolutions which claim to break from the past depend on inherited frameworks of understanding. They reject content, not structure. Technology has amplified the process. The more data we create, the more we depend on algorithms to filter it. Digital memory is vast but fragile. What is not indexed effectively does not exist. The internet appears infinite, yet it forgets faster than any library. A broken link, an expired format, a lost password, each a small erasure in a network built to preserve. Philosophers have long debated whether forgetting is failure or function. Nietzsche called it the condition of happiness. Without forgetting, life would be unbearable. Yet he also warned that excessive forgetting produces amnesia of meaning. A civilization too focused on progress risks losing the ability to measure it. Without memory, improvement becomes motion without direction. The architecture of forgetting can be traced not only in institutions, but in the material world. Consider the way old technologies are discarded: steam engines scrapped for electric grids, manuscripts replaced by digital screens. Each new layer of convenience hides the mechanisms that preceded it. Modernity's gleam depends on the invisibility of its foundation. Even the landscapes of communication reveal the pattern. Early photography was hailed as a tool of memory, yet its chemical fragility has erased countless moments. Film replaced glass, digital replaced film. Each advancement promised permanence while accelerating obsolescence. What survives is not what was most valuable, but what was most adaptable. In this light, the forgotten is not always lost. It is transformed. Memory mutates into residue images without context, ruins without names, concepts without origins. These fragments resurface unpredictably, prompting rediscovery and reinterpretation. The resurgence of interest in erased histories may reflect this cyclical rhythm of awareness. What disappears from consciousness eventually returns as curiosity. Psychologists describe such recurrence as the return of the repressed. What has been excluded seeks re-entry through symbol, art, or myth. In collective terms, the same applies to history. Lost civilizations reappear in dreams, literature, and speculation, not because they are proven, but because they fill the space left by silence. The persistence of these ideas suggests that forgetting is never total. It is more like sediment covering, but not destroying. The architecture of forgetting, then, is built not of stone but of narrative. It constructs walls of explanation, roofs of authority, floors of convenience. Inside the structure, knowledge feels secure until cracks appear. A misplaced artifact, a contradictory text, a question that refuses to close. Each anomaly exposes the hidden scaffolding of what we believe to be true. Scholars who study memory call these anomalies sites of disruption. They are moments when history reveals its incompleteness. The discovery of a buried street, a lost map, or an untranslatable word reopens a conversation that institutions thought finished. Forgetting must constantly repair itself to maintain coherence. And so the cycle continues, remembering, erasing, rediscovering, redefining. The pattern is as old as civilization. The Sumerians rebuilt on their own ruins, the Romans erased their predecessors. The modern world does the same with data and design. Each generation believes it begins anew, unaware that its foundations are composed of forgotten foundations. Perhaps that is why the metaphor of architecture fits so well. To forget is not to destroy, but to build over. Every monument stands upon another, every archive upon ashes, every ideology upon older faiths. The stability we experience is a balance between remembering enough to continue and forgetting enough to change. The danger lies in mistaking forgetting for progress. When erasure becomes routine, meaning thins. We repeat structures without knowing why, reproduce systems whose origins we no longer question. In doing so, we risk becoming caretakers of forms whose purpose has evaporated. Yet within this danger lies possibility. Forgetting creates space to reinterpret, to rebuild, to imagine differently. The challenge is awareness, to know that forgetting is happening while it happens. Only then can memory remain dynamic rather than dogmatic. The architecture of forgetting is therefore not an enemy of knowledge but its companion. It ensures that history never becomes static. What we call rediscovery is merely the act of seeing through layers we ourselves have laid down. Dust is what remains when memory finishes speaking. It settles over stone, over paper, over time itself, indifferent to what it covers. Yet dust is not absence. It is accumulation, the visible trace of everything that once existed together. In that sense, dust remembers more faithfully than we do. It records without judgment. It holds the fragments of empires' names and lives long after the stories have faded. Beneath it, echoes endure. The story that began with a vanishing name returns here to the silence that follows. Tartaria, once written across continents now confined to the margins of old maps, has become less a place than an idea, a symbol of how civilizations construct and deconstruct their own pasts. Whether or not it ever existed as empire, its disappearance reveals a truth deeper than geography, the fragility of memory itself. The layers of forgetting we have traced, maps, rewritten cities, rebuilt networks buried, are not accidents of time. They are features of civilization as essential as roads or language. To build a world that feels complete, humanity must choose what to remember. What is left behind becomes sediment, then silence, then myth. The dust that covers the forgotten is not its end, but its transformation. Across centuries, the cycle repeats. Knowledge grows, collapses, and grows again. Each era imagines itself as the culmination of progress, only to be rediscovered later as another layer. The ground beneath our feet is not merely soil, it is compressed experience. The city above and the ruins below are the same story told at different speeds. Archaeologists brushing dust from an artifact often describe a sensation difficult to name, a moment when the boundary between past and present dissolves. The object is both ancient and immediate, both fragment and mirror. That sensation is the essence of history, the realization that time is not a line, but a resonance. What once was continues not as repetition, but as vibration beneath awareness. Perhaps that is what the echoes beneath the dust truly are. The reverberations of ideas that refuse to die even when their names are lost. The concept of Tartaria, whatever its origins, persists not because of evidence, but because it fulfills a need. It restores to the imagination what rational history has streamlined away, the sense that the world is older, wider, and more interconnected than we can prove. To dismiss that need as delusion would be to misunderstand it. Human beings do not seek mystery because they lack information. They seek it because knowledge alone does not satisfy. The unknown provides context, a reminder that certainty is temporary. The allure of lost civilizations, hidden networks, or erased histories is at its core an expression of humility, a recognition that no map can capture everything. Dust embodies this humility. It settles on the grand and the trivial, alike erasing hierarchy. The same particles that once formed mountains now rest on glass screens. The residue of stars mixes with the residue of breath. To study dust is to confront the equality of all things before time. That equality is unsettling. It contradicts the human impulse to rank, to categorize, to define. Yet it is within that contradiction that perspective returns. For historians, the challenge is to balance curiosity with caution, to question without claiming, to interpret without asserting. The story of Tartaria invites both fascination and restraint. Its traces, architectural similarities, linguistic echoes, cultural overlaps remain open to interpretation. Each clue may point to connection or coincidence or something between. The task is not to decide, but to understand why the question persists. In this light, the endurance of the Tartaria narrative becomes a study in cultural psychology. It demonstrates how collective imagination compensates for the architecture of forgetting. When institutional history narrows, public curiosity widens to fill the void. Legends appear where documentation fails, functioning as emotional counterweights to official silence. They remind us that history is not merely a record of what happened, but of what people needed to believe about what happened. Perhaps that is why forgotten names resurface precisely when societies feel uncertain. In times of rapid change, memory becomes a form of grounding. The appeal of rediscovered worlds reflects the anxiety of losing one's own. The farther progress advances, the more we look backward for orientation. The past becomes not a place but a mirror in which the present examines itself. Seen this way, the myth of the erased empire is not about deception but about desire. The desire for coherence, for continuity, for a story large enough to contain the fragments. The absence of Tartaria on modern maps matters less than the presence of the idea in modern minds. It reminds us that erasure, however thorough, is never total. The human need to remember outlives the systems built to manage memory. Dust in its stillness teaches the same lesson. Beneath its surface lies potential. When disturbed, it rises, catches the light, reveals motion. So too with the forgotten, what seems buried can return at any moment, reframed by new questions, reinterpreted by new minds. History is not the final word. It is an ongoing negotiation between what we know, what we guess, and what we feel. The quiet persistence of forgotten things suggests that forgetting and remembering are not opposites but partners. Each makes the other possible. Without forgetting, memory would drown in detail. Without memory, forgetting would have no meaning. The balance between them defines civilization's rhythm. The disappearance of Tartaria was one such rhythm, a necessary silence between phases of curiosity. Its rediscovery, real or imagined, marks the next beat. If dust preserves, it also equalizes. It covers monuments and ruins, maps and cities, scholars and dreamers. Under enough time, everything becomes indistinguishable. Yet within that sameness, patterns re-emerge. The star-shaped fortresses, the buried foundations, the repeating geometries all speak in the same language form, seeking continuity. Whether born of strategy, coincidence, or something deeper, they reveal that human creation always circles back to what feels eternal. In moments of quiet reflection, one might imagine future archaeologists uncovering the remains of our own civilization, the glass, the plastic, the metal, wondering who we were. They will read our data as we now read ancient stones, partial, fragmented, ambiguous. What they conclude will say as much about them as about us. That is the irony of history. It reflects the present more than the past. The question then is not whether Tartaria was real, but what its memory reveals about us. The fascination with what has been erased speaks to a collective awareness that erasure continues. Our maps may be more precise than ever, but precision does not guarantee understanding. The unknown has merely changed location, from the edges of continents to the depths of consciousness. In the end, the echo that lingers beneath the dust is not the voice of a lost empire, but of recognition. It reminds us that forgetting is never final, that the past is not gone, but transformed, waiting to be seen differently. To remember responsibly is not to claim certainty, but to honor complexity, to admit that knowledge like architecture is built upon ruins. When sunlight filters through a forgotten room and catches the air dust becomes visible again, shimmering like thought. For a moment it seems alive. In that shimmer lies the paradox of history. What appears still is moving. What seems gone is present. What we call lost may simply be waiting for light. Perhaps that is where Tartaria lives now, not in maps or monuments, but in that glimmer between forgetting and remembering. It exists wherever curiosity disturbs the settled air of certainty, wherever questions rise and dance before settling once more. The dust will fall again as it always does, covering the evidence and the echoes alike. But somewhere beneath it, the trace endures a reminder that the story of humanity is not a line, but a circle drawn in layers, each new one resting gently on what came before. And if there is meaning in that, it is this: nothing is ever entirely lost, only waiting to be seen differently.